Sí, Jaro, ya tráeme mi moneda que aventé al mar. Yo sí me apunto con la próxima viuda. Atentamente el Jimmy y el de los riñones.
El chaparro es el Funko de Pepe Aguilar. Sí se pasó de verga el gobernador, así quedan cuando los quimios son de agua.
Gracias por el follow.
Te chuparon el culo porque da menos asco que tu cara. Jaro, dice el güey del cáncer que estás tan feo que hasta le dieron ganas de que hoy fuera el día. Jaro, estás más pendejo que tener epilepsia de tiempo. Jaro, el cojo te invitó, ¿verdad? Entonces ya sabemos quién te chupó el culo. Un aplauso para el Jaro, banda.
Y apenas va empezando este cotorreo, ¿eh? ¿Más arriba o qué pedo? ¿Más arriba o qué pedo? Vengan los aplausos. Vengan. Vamos a recibir a Felisa Vicente.
Buenas noches, Guadalajara. ¿Ya se cansaron? Yo ya, la verdad yo ya. Como que uno llega a una edad que dices, mira, los zapatos de la Flexi no están tan feos, ¿no? Dices.
O sea, sí estoy.
Uno se está poniendo, señora, aquí vemos señoras. Allá atrás, mis señoras. Sí son. Está chido ser señora. Si te emperras que te digan señora, es muy de señora emperrarse, déjame te digo. Sin embargo, soy una señora que no tiene hijos, que no nada. Y ahora que pienso en los hijos, digo, realmente yo no he querido tener uno, o ya me hice a la idea. Porque así que alguien haya querido tener uno conmigo tampoco, ¿sabes? O sea, no ha habido ocasión que se rompa el condón, que el güey me diga, no te preocupes, no te tomes la pastilla del día siguiente, que sea lo que Dios quiera. No, al contrario, abrió su cajón, sacó 2 patadas, me las dio, dije, ay, creo que este chico no es de familia. Está cabrón. Soy una señora soltera, una señora que no cocina. ¿Habemos señoras que cocinamos? ¿Tú eres Felipa? Doña Felipa, usted cocina. Chila, y es de las que critica, ¿verdad? De las que te dicen, ¿a poco tú haces la sopa con hortomate? ¿Y tú qué tiene? 2 cubitos, 5 pesos. Porque ya todo el mundo cocina. Yo no cocino porque soy hija de mamá fodonga, la verdad. Esa mamá que cuando era el convivio decía, tú no vas a llevar guisado, ¿eh? Si te piden algo, tú vas a llevar, ¿qué? El desechable. Es mi mamá. Vas a llevar el desechable, ¿no? Porque si es una perdedera de tiempo cocinar, ¿no? Yo digo, si mi mamá hubiera aprovechado ese tiempo en otra cosa, licenciatura tendría la señora. No estaría con mi papá. Pero ya todo el mundo cocina. Resulta que todo el mundo cocina, los hombres cocinan. Voy a preguntar. ¿Hombres cocinan? Ay, aguas, porque se está en celo. Me cagan, los hombres cocinan, hornean, dicen. ¿Qué sigue? ¿Que nos respeten? Ay, por favor. Por favor, sálganse de nuestra pinche cocina, en todos lados quieren estar. Siento que los hombres nada más aprenden... ¿Qué? Siento que nada más aprendieron a cocinar con tal de no lavar los pinches trastes. Y el día que te cocinan, 3 sartenes se ensucian y un huevo te hicieron. Me cagan. Pero ¿sabes qué? Dicen que el amor tiene que ver con la cocinada. Yo no sé ustedes qué opinan. Dicen que a los hombres se les conquista por el estómago. Es lo que yo digo. Yo he conquistado unos más abajo del estómago, pero mira, cada quien. Y luego sí, ¿no? Como que puedes perder el amor. Yo tuve un novio que era de Tlaxcala y me caga que digan, Tlaxcala no existe. Sí existe. Amiga, tú te ves estudiada. Oílo. ¿Cómo supo? Ay, sí. Amiga, tú que te ves estudiada, por 10 puntos. ¿Con qué estados colinda Tlaxcala? Puebla, bien, te ayudaron. Ahí también se produce buen camote, déjame te digo. Y ese camote, digo, este novio me invitó al cumpleaños de su abuelita porque le iban a hacer un mole. Y yo me preocupé porque dije, ¿cómo que su abuelita no va a cocinar en su propio cumpleaños? ¿Qué clase de Tlaxcala es esta, no? O sea, porque si algo saben hacer las abuelitas es mole, arroz y darte la bendición, ¿no? Así, y nada más. Doña Felipa, ¿sabe hacer mole? ¿O solo da la bendición? ¿O bendice también su mole? Porque esa madre es una cuestión gastronómica, ¿no? Y yo no sé ustedes si sepan, pero Tlaxcala tiene su cosa gastronómica. Nos dio el taco de canasta, el pulque, la prostitución. Y yo no sé ustedes, pero a mí me han dicho que al pueblo que fueres, haz lo que vieres. Ya les dije que yo soy muy mala para cocinar. No, la verdad me preocupé porque es una tradición milenaria, ¿sí o no, doña Felipa? Es una mezcla de un chingo de cosas, especies, rezos, lleva esa madre, chiles, ¿no? Sobre todo un chingo de chiles. Y yo, pues en ese entonces nomás conocía al del nieto. No, sí, pregúntame ahorita y mira, pinche salsa molcajeteada te hago. Mole de autor preparo yo. Pero yo dije, bueno, si esta señora le van a hacer el mole, pues entonces yo voy a llevar, ¿qué? El desechable, pon atención. El desechable. Y me armé de 500 juegos de todo, ¿no? Cuchara, plato, tenedor. Llevaba todo yo, mira, hasta pinches saleros así con encaje. Le puse a todos los vasos así alrededor. Recuerdo de mi cumpleaños, doña Rosita 2015. Que me voy como puedo, ¿no? Porque ya ves que el unicel no pesa, pero como estorba. Y llego y ya me estaba esperando, ¿quién creen? La tía más culera. Esa señora que parece que nació cocinando. Sí, ¿dónde está doña Evelia? Levante la mano, doña Evelia. No sé si es, pero no sé si es como doña Evelia, si topas, que tiene el pelo cortito, que usa su zapatilla guarache, ¿no? Que fuma un chingo. Cuando se le acaba un cigarro, lo apaga y prende el otro así de la flama de la estufa. Esa señora culera, ¿sabes? Que te ve toda así, con su ceja verde chueca, ¿no? Porque se la tatuó. Y dices que tiene un chingo de niños Dios en su casa, ¿no? Pero nada más tiene uno morenito. Que ese morenito tiene las chapitas rosas y los ojos azules, ¿no? Como paleta payaso. Y dice, ese es mi favorito, pero nunca lo pone en el nacimiento la culera. Esa señora, que me dice, qué bueno que ya llegaste, hija, para que nos ayudes. Y yo le dije, no mames, señora, pues si yo traje el desechable. Me dormí bien tarde, le hice alrededor a los vasos con los dientes. Que me dice, no, ya el mole ya está, lo que vamos a hacer es matar pollos. Y yo dije, señora, yo nunca he matado un pollo. Una polla sí, pero un pollo jamás. Y ya no, que me lleva ahí, en el patio había más pollos que gente de Tlaxcala. Ahí estaba yo, me dice, me pasan un pollo, porque me dice, aquí la que no ayuda no come. Y yo, ok, agarro el pollo, un pinche cuchillo. Ahí estaba yo, veía el pollo, el cuchillo. No pude, güey, agarré un pinche cuchillo desechable. Agarra y lo rompe de su cuello, no hacia la verga y así. Me vio como estúpida, quedé como tan inútil que me dijeron, mira, mejor vete por los chescos del nieto. Ay, sí. No es cierto, iba yo sola, bien acomedida que era yo. No, pero quedé tan mal, güey, que yo dije, esta es mi última cena con ellos. Es mi última cena, ni siquiera salí en la foto. O sea, yo entendí, ¿sabes? Yo dije, me voy a poner en la orilla. Porque ya ves que cuando sales con alguien y vas con la familia, así como que te ponen en la orilla por si un día te tienen que recortar. Y ahí estaba yo así de que ya me estaba acomodando y dice, no, hija, mejor tómala tú. Sí, señora. ¿Cómo no? Ay, bueno. Sí me sentí bien mal, ¿no? Sí dije, sí es mi última cena. Dije, ¿soy María Magdalena? Porque ya ves que ella, se dicen que estaba en la cena, pero no la vemos. Yo creo que le pasó lo mismo, ¿no? Iba a tomar la foto y dijo, no, tómala tú, hija, y ya se regresó. Porque, a ver, pongámonos a pensar en la cocinada en tiempos de Diosito. Jesús muy chingón repartiendo sus pescados, multiplicándolos por todo el mundo, pero yo me pregunto, ¿quién los descamaba? Yo me imagino que le pidió ayuda a María Magdalena, ¿no? Y ella se negó. Yo también me hubiera negado. Yo también me hubiera bajado a lavarle los pies. Porque a veces los lavó con su cabellito, ¿no? Y sus lágrimas como muestra de agradecimiento. Y dices, ¿agradecimiento? Pinche pena que... Imagínate tú ser una mujer empoderada de ese entonces, vendiéndole el cuerpo a quien querías, a la hora que querías, para terminar lavándole los pies a un cabrón. No mames, sí me hubiera dejado apedrear, decía ella. Y yo me imagino que a María Magdalena llega a la última cena con su desechable, ¿no? Porque pues no es pendeja. Y le dice Jesús, qué bueno que llegaste, manita, para que ya nos ayudes con los pescados. Y le dice, ya no mames, Chuy. Sí, yo traje el desechable. Me dormí bien tarde, le hice alrededor a los vasos. A cada uno le puse el recuerdo de mi última cena, Jesús 33 DC. Sube una voz al fondo que le dice, aquí la que no ayuda no come. Era San Judas. ¿Sí topas a San Judas? Con su pelito corto, que usa su zapatilla guarache. Se le acaba un cigarro, prende el otro con su propia flamita. Dices, dice Jesús, bueno, está bien, ya no pasa nada. ¿Por qué no te bajas por los chescos? Ah, no es cierto. No es cierto, Jesús no era así, doña Felipa, usted sabe. Que le dice, bueno, si no vas a hacer los pescados, pues entonces lávanos los pies a todos. Dice, no mames, Jesús, tú te estás pasando, ¿eh? Yo solo hice una vez y porque eras tú. Tus amigos son 12. Eso es prostitución y no estamos en Tlaxcala. Amigos, yo sé que ese chiste no da tanta risa, pero es que yo en la comedia como Tlaxcala trato. ¡Muchas gracias!
Felisa Vicente, por favor, fuerte el aplauso. Galerías. Tu segunda ocasión en Pur de Patos, ¿verdad, Felisa?
Tercera.
Tercera ocasión, ¿dónde te subiste?
En Marqueteatro, las dos.
¿Las dos veces?
Sí.
Muy bien, muy bien. También grabaste algo especial, ¿verdad? El cojo.
¿Algo especial?
Grabaste también los especialitos, ¿no?
Ah, sí, los especialitos.
Muy bien.
Ajá.
¿Cómo cambió tu vida Pur de Patos, Felisa? Muy bien, gracias.
No, bien, la verdad. ¿Qué? Ay, que fue culero. Ay, sí. No, muy bien. La verdad es que el público es bien chido y ha sido muy. Unos no tanto, pero todos chido, la mayoría.
Oye, la gente se pregunta de dónde eres oriunda.
De la Guerrero, de la Ciudad de México.
Ah, ¿eres de la Guerrero?
La Guerrero,
Muy
ajá.
bien, muy bien.
Sí,
alguien
pues
pensaba
sí, ni modo que no se me note.
Bueno, no sé. Harold parecía de Holanda, ¿no? Sí.
Al
Que
lado.
vendía los helados, ¿no? Porque...
De Nestlé decías.
Oye, Felisa, qué chingón que estás aquí. Galerías te tiene bien acobijada. Por favor, fuerte el aplauso a Felisa
Gracias.
Vicente. Porque se viene el Cojito Feliz. O mejor conocido como la...
Gracias a la que me dice que me ama y me dice chichis de perro al mismo tiempo. Si me inscribo a tu club Herbalife, ¿me vas a regalar la primera malteada? Ya ven, si sirve comprarle mazapanes a las niñas. Parece demostradora de maquillaje de la bodega Urrera. ¿Dónde está la boxeadora argelina cuando se le necesita? Así se ven todas las morras de Tlajomulco. Hijos de su chingada madre, ¿por qué me ponen a leer esto? No soy astrónomo, pero estoy seguro de que tienes hoyo negro. Sí, ya acabó doñita de decir sus gracias, pues ya limpia el camerino. Feliz acoge con tantos hombres que traen las tortas ahogadas. Si en las fiestas te siguen pidiendo desechable, lleva tu rutina. Oh. Qué chido que le den chance a la chava del estacionamiento. Felisa, Jaro y el Cojo son la muestra de que Dios aprieta. Qué chido tu cosplay de niña pobre. Ojalá estuviera aquí Adrián Marcelo para decirte que estás bien pendeja. El de cáncer vio a Felisa y le dio 500 pesos él a ella. Sí, pero ya deme mi quesadilla de chicharrón. Felisa es la novia del chofer que te cobra el pasaje. Así se va a ver la hija que no es del Cojo. Chinguen a su madre. Si estuvieras en la casa de los famosos, estarías en el cuarto tierra, en las rodillas. Hijos de la verga, es que sí, escribieron muchos. Felisa menstruando le va al Atlas porque es rojinegra. Esa señora me tusó cuando iba en primaria. Ya vimos quién prepara las empanadas que vende Jaro. En esto estoy gastando mis últimos momentos de vida. Atentamente, los güeyes de cáncer. Feliz es la señora que hace las tandas de colchas y te las entrega ya usadas. Ok, pero ya dígame en cuánto está la clase de Zumba. Felisa forma parte del cast diverso de María de todos los Ángeles. Felisa es como si Oblatos fuera una persona. ¿En qué se van a parecer en unas semanas el de los riñones y Jorge Vergara? Así se veía doña Felipa de Cachorra. ¿Cómo le hicieron para que estuviera la voz de Alexa en el escenario y en la mesa? Un aplauso para Felisa.
Cámara. Último comediante. Es un chingón. Un chingón. Directamente desde Paupérrimo. Amigazo. Él es Illich Flores.
¿Qué tranza, pandilla? Me mama estar en Guadalajara. Muchas gracias. Güey, en farmacia, aquí en Guadalajara, en farmacias Guadalajara, todos los jarabes son tapatíos. Está bien verga, güey. Ella le acaba de entender, ahorita se cagó de risa, güey. Digo, no mames. Claro, güey. Oigan, ¿qué pedo? Me llamo Illich, güey. No es un nombre artístico, es mi nombre real, güey. ¿No? Sí, si hubiera tenido un nombre artístico me hubiera gustado llamarme el Jaro, un pedo así, güey. ¿No? Yo sufría mucho de niño, güey, porque todos mis amigos tenían apodos bien chingones, ya sabes, el pollo, el chino, el cacas, güey, ¿no? Siempre hay un cacas, güey. Saco, embarro el fierro, a ver, ahora, ¿qué dices, culero, ah? Ese es el antialbur, güey. Saco, embarro, ¿cómo ves, güey? Me retacas, ¿cómo ves? A huevo, te lo lleno de frijoles y así te lo chupo, ¿cómo ves? Sí, pandilla. Entonces, un día estaba yo llorando muy culero, güey, porque yo quería que me pusieran un apodo y mi mamá me vio, güey. Me dijo, ¿qué tienes? Y es que mis amigos tienen una cabezota de más, güey. Quiero que me pongan un apodo, güey. Quiero un apodo, jefita. Y ya me dijo mi mamá, voy a ir a hablar con tus compañeros, güey, para que te pongan un apodo. Y a partir de ese día ya todos me empezaron a decir el putito, ¿no? Ya. ¡Putita! Ese chiste lo conté a propósito, güey. Así a huevo. Yo sabía que iba a terminar en eso, güey. Oye, a mí me decían el putito, pero al chaparro le decían el Bambi, güey, porque cualquier güey con un buen rifle se podía chingar a su mamá, güey. Sí, ahorita me va a chingar bien culero, güey. Ahorita me va a hacer así, güey. Y me va a dejar ahí, güey. Bueno, sí, pandilla. Fíjense que me acabo de casar, pandilla. Acá ando bien contento, güey. Me acabo de casar. Sí, güey, mira. Sí, me acabo de casar y al chile ve, ya me hago de comer yo solo, por eso ya estoy más gordo, güey. Mi vieja se parece un poquito, güey. No es por presumir, pero se parece un poquito a Belinda, güey. Un poquito, güey. No, sin mamada, se parece un poquito a Belinda. Y un chingo al Piojo Herrera, güey. Pero pues, güey. Güey, Dios da, Dios quita, güey. ¿Qué tiene, güey? ¿Qué tiene? Está güera, yo gano. Pero hubo un tiempo en mi vida en el que yo no encontraba el amor, pandilla. Fue ese tiempo de la universidad. ¿Hay banda que haya estudiado la universidad? A huevo. Es un momento bien cabrón en la vida de uno, güey, porque empiezas a ver cómo todo el mundo encuentra pareja, güey, menos tú, güey, ¿no? Ahí, tú estás ahí todo pendejo y no encuentras pareja, güey. Y yo me acuerdo que incluso yo vi a unas compañeras que eran lesbianas y entre ellas decidieron andar y todo iba muy bien con su relación, pusieron un negocio, fueron muy prósperas, le iba muy bien a todas ellas dos, pero empezaron a drogarse, güey, ya sabes, güey, cayeron muy mal en la droga y ahí fue donde me di cuenta de que definitivamente la piedra le gana a la tijera, güey, bien culero. Pobres chavas, güey. Pero hasta ellas se encontraron el amor y yo valía verga, güey. Valía verga porque ustedes están viendo ahorita mi versión delgada. Pero yo en la universidad, te lo juro, güey. Mírame. No, hasta los cuadritos se me ven, culero. Traigo el abdomen bien marcado, mira. A huevo, güey. Me embarazas y me dejas con los chavos, ¿cómo ves? No me voy a dejar alburear, a todos me los voy a coger. A todos, échenme sus albures. Entonces, yo no encontraba el albur, iba a decir, güey, no mames. No encontraba el amor, güey, y dije, güey, estoy muy gordo, güey, yo sé que me va a costar trabajo que alguien me pele, güey, al chile estoy muy gordo, güey, ¿no? Cuando me metí a nadar parecía el tinaco, ¿no? Ese viajando de estado en estado, güey. Sí, porque me metí a nadar con playera negra, güey, ¿no? Quería encontrar el pinche amor, güey, y me enamoré de una compañera, güey. Esa compañera me gustaba un chingo. Fue amor a primera vista porque lo primero que le vi fue el culo, güey, al chile. Sí, güey. ¡Presto! ¿Cómo ven? Arrendo, me lo dejan retacado y remendado y engargolado. Entonces, así voy a acabar con los albures. Entonces, a mí me gustaba esta chica que se llamaba Ada, güey, porque pinche vieja. No, nunca. Güey, le empecé a hacer sus tareas desde primer semestre hasta sexto semestre, güey, ¿va? O sea, yo estudiaba Derecho y ella estudiaba Arquitectura, chinga tu madre, güey. O sea, todavía dijeras, eran mis tareas, güey. Hoy te sé echar varilla, colado, pared, güey. No mames, güey. Y ya un buen día dije, la voy a conquistar con esta técnica, ¿no? De causarle lástima y hacerle sus tareas, güey. Acá con mis 4 tetas en una, porque yo estaba bien gordito. Yo sabía que era gordito, güey. Pero tenía yo mi corazoncito, güey. Y un día dije, ya me agarré de huevos, ya como por el 7º semestre. Dije, yo creo que ya es tiempo suficiente, ¿no? Y me decidí, güey, ataqué, güey. Junté una lana, ya sabes, lavé unos carros, robé a unos microbuseros, güey. Generé, ¿no? Ya traía yo. Y llegué y le dije, oye, Ada, ¿cómo estás? Buenas tardes. Y me dijo, ¿quién eres? Digo, soy yo. El chico de las tareas, ¿no? Y me dijo, ya. Y le dije, es que mira, he pensado mucho en ti desde que te conocí. Estoy muy enamorado. Fue algo que no pude evitar. Te pido una disculpa y de atrás tiempo te pongo. Oh, que la chingada. Déjame, estoy abriendo a mi perro corazón y tú estás abriéndome el fundillo, culero. Déjame aquí generar. Entonces, esta chica le dije, oye, me gustaría, pues eso, ¿no? Que me gustas mucho. Si no tienes problema, me gustaría invitarte un día al cine, ya sabes, pasar por ti. No me digas, bien lejos, no importa, yo sé transbordar, yo pago las micros, le dije, ¿no? No sé si por tu casa haya un Cinemex, Ada, ¿no? Porque me gustaría invitarte ya sabes, un combo parejas. Aunque tú y yo nada más seamos amigos, ¿no? O sea, pero pues y le dije, le dije, Ada, pues me gustaría eso, saber si te gustaría ser mi novia, güey. Y nunca voy a olvidar lo que ella me dijo, banda, nunca, güey. Pero, o sea, si hubiera sido así, hubiera sido más relax para mí, güey. Si me hubiera dicho no, estaba bien. Pero ella le hizo, no, güey, no. Y sabes, o sea, no es el no, güey, es los 16 nos en ese pinche tren emocional, güey, que van del asco al rechazo, al odio, güey. Hasta una sensación como de victimización de ¿por qué me haces esto, güey? ¿No? O sea, me destrozó, güey, me dejó bien vergueado, güey. Al chile empecé a ir a terapia después de eso, güey, ¿no? Fui con la psicóloga porque ella no nada más me dijo que no, me dijo, Illich, es que mírate, güey. Me dijo, mírate, güey, mira tu pinche cuerpo, güey. Y le dije, ¿qué tiene, güey? ¿Que estoy panzón y se me juntan las rodillas? Y me dijo, no, güey, es que mírate, tienes cuerpo como de botella de Tonayan, güey. No sé si tomen Tonayan aquí en Guadalajara, güey, pero es un elixir. No mames, el Tonayan está hecho de todas las lágrimas de la clase media, pandilla, de todas. Por eso da esas crudas, güey. que me compararan con eso me sacó de onda. Le dije, ¿por qué? ¿Por qué piensas que tengo cuerpo de Tonayan? Me dijo, mírate, estás gordo, corriente y estriado, como la botella del Tonayan, güey. Y al chile sí estoy estriado, güey, pero son muy mis estrías y ya no me ibas a coger, ¿para qué me criticabas, güey? ¿No? Pinches chingaderas, güey, ¿no? Por eso uno termina en terapia, vale verga, y de comediante aquí como el Harold, haciendo puras mamadas, güey, ¿no? Entonces, me dijo, además a mí me gusta tu amigo Jonathan, güey, ¿no? Verga, güey, Jonathan. Y Jonathan era un culero que tenía mocasines con dragones bordados, así como esos dragones todos pinches nacos, güey. Gente que usa dragones en la ropa, abro hilo, ¿no? Y el pinche Jonathan tenía esos dragones y bueno, él se la ligó y yo no, güey, al chile eso me mandó a terapia y le dije a la doctora todo esto que les acabo de contar. Y cuando ella finalmente me terminó de escuchar me dijo, pues es que mírate, Illich, tienes... No, me dijo así, me dijo, lo que hiciste estuvo bien, güey, le dijiste los sentimientos que tenías, eso es válido, güey, lo hiciste con respeto, con educación, eso es válido, güey. También es válido que ella te rechace, pero a lo mejor te lastimó y eso a lo mejor tienes que arreglarlo, le tienes que hacer saber que te lastimó y que no está bien, ¿no? Busca la manera correcta de expresarte. Y yo por ese tiempo creía que yo iba a ser el siguiente Ricardo Arjona, entonces le compuse un poema, güey. Y yo, según pareciéndome a Ricardo Arjona, me parezco más al JJ el narco, ¿no, güey? Acá. Parece que acabo de salir del baño de partir del cerebro al Cabañas, güey, ¿no? No sean así, güey. Entonces ya, güey, yo me decidí a hacerle un poema, güey, porque estaba yo en un curso de poesía. Entonces es un poema que les quiero declamar el día de hoy. Obviamente es un poema que tiene coreografía, porque pues estudié en escuela pública, ¿no? Como les decía, güey. Ahí te enseñan a bailar la poesía, así no, carnal, ¿no? Acá de dulce madre, no te alejes de tu vista, no me apartes, ven conmigo a todo. Entonces, pues es un poema que tiene coreografía y hay que dice así, y espero que les guste mucho Guadalajara. Amiga y magia son palabras que se escriben con las mismas letras. No importa el orden en que las leas, importa más el orden en que las creas, porque amiga y magia se escriben con las mismas letras. Hada, a mí me basta esta tarde con cerrar los ojos para hacer el truco y que tú dejes de ser mi amiga para que te conviertas en mi magia, porque amiga y magia se escriben con las mismas letras. Pero Tonayan y Jonathan también, hija de tu reputa madre, ¿eh? Muchas gracias, pandilla.
¡Illich Flores! Tráetelo.
Fuerte aplauso a Illich Flores. Y más fuerte para la maestra Alexa Stewart.
No se enamoren de mí porque yo soy bien culera. Qué chistoso que Illich se come la tripa y al cojo se las empuja. Alexa y Felisa son Evelia y Felipa del pasado. Lo chido de que hayan venido Illich, Felisa y Jaro es que se pueden regresar en el mismo camión. Ay, no, cuando Illich hizo su coreografía me dio miedo de que empezara a llover. El Jaro 2.0. ¿Te quieres sentir viejo? Así se ve el guarura de Laura en América. Tienes cuerpo de que pronto vas a tener que buscarle esposo a tu viuda. Tus hijos son hijos de pendejo. Ay, hasta que por fin apareció el tinaco que se voló. Ahora, a Cojo le dicen Manzanillo, Colima, porque está abajo de Vallarta. Ah, caray, pues qué pregunté. Dime, se parece un poquito al Cojo y un chingo a una cruz de caca. Pero chiquita, sí, de frente. Así crecen los niños groseros, ¿eh? Pórtate bien, pórtate bien. Puro pendejo trae bigote. Doña Evelia tiene un ropero del tamaño de Lilich. Qué cagado el shocker moreno. Parece mi tía espaldona que a fuerza se inscribió en el CUSEI. Bueno, ¿esto era show o tribuna de AA? Así quedan los luchadores después de que les hacen el martinete. Como que siente que a Illich le hubieran quitado la máscara y no. Illich Flores parece un poquito a Latin Lover y un chingo a una cabeza olmeca. Illich parece boxeadora de Argelia. Ay, no. Qué cagado el chofer de Calandria. Illich, aquí te tengo un poema. Ahora entiendo que la chava te bateara, pero para valer verga no era necesario venir hasta Guadalajara. Illich está tan culero que nadie nunca le ha pedido que dé la cara. Por güeyes como Illich es que dividen la zona de mujeres en el tianguis. ¡Muchas gracias!
¡Guadalajara!
Publicazo esta noche. De verdad, Guadalajara, si ustedes nos prometen que se van a portar así de chingones, hay que venir más seguido, tío Robert. Yo creo que 2 veces al año se puede hacer tour de patos en Guadalajara, güey.
Igual hasta 3. Depende de la fiesta del rato.
Tío Robert, antes que todo, un aplauso para todo el elenco. El aplauso para Lalo Villar. El aplauso para Jimmy, para Chaparro Salazar, para Alexa Suart, Felisa, Jaro, Illich, la coproducción de La Conciertera y Feliz Producciones.
Vengan, por favor, Alexa, Chaparro y Lalo. No mamen, cabrón, los queremos un chingo. Han sido parte importantísima de este proyecto.
Gracias. Esto no solo es gracias a los que estamos acá, sino los que están allá. Ustedes saben que sin ustedes no se hace este programa. Gracias también por venir de Último Deseo. Gracias a toda la gente terminal que decide venir. Ahora sí, vamos a despedir. ¿Algunas palabras, tío Robert? ¿Algo que decir?
No, banda, muchísimas gracias. La gente que lo está viendo, ustedes han hecho pur de patos así, sin pelos en la lengua y con toda la pinche humildad del mundo. El mejor puto programa de comedia de México. Y háganle como quieran. Empútense los que quieran. A eso me remito, chingada madre.
Hasta luego.
Ya, tío, ya, vámonos.
No, déjame.
Ya cálmese, tío, se le va a subir la presión como el año pasado.
¡Felipa!
Pásame mi pastilla, Felipa.
¿Qué le pasó al niño? ¿Qué hacen aquí los niños, Felipa? Júntate 2 sillas, ya duérmelos.
Pues bueno.
No, banda, muchísimas gracias. Pur de Patos, sigue, cabrones. Sigue y sigue, a ver cuántos pinches años nos dura.
Es gracias a todos ustedes, de verdad, de corazón. Sin ustedes no somos nada.
Gracias, banda, los llevamos en el corazón, me cae de madres.
Nos despedimos con el ya clásico.
No.
Muchísimas gracias. Volvemos a la que sigue. Hasta luego. Ajá.
As regular viewers of this channel know, an eerie number of cases seem to take place in quiet little towns, and today's first entry is no exception. La Bulache, Argentina, a community of about 20,000 residents. A peaceful place, far removed from the violence often seen in larger cities. The perfect place for a kid to grow up. On the afternoon of June 29th, 2023, 14-year-old Joaquin Sperani rode his bike to school as per usual, though strangely didn't attend any of his classes. Instead, he left the premises with his lifelong best friend, a 13-year-old known only as Elle. The two boys had been close since elementary school, and their families often spent time together. That previous year, Elle had requested a school transfer so he could spend more time with his closest companion. Joaquin was an introverted soul who had few other friends, and who was often the target of bullies, and so, naturally, he was over the moon with Elle's decision. That lunch break, the pair were captured by a local resident security camera, walking side by side in the opposite direction of the school. This still shows them smiling and laughing. Unbeknownst to all but one person, it would be the last image captured of Joaquin, alive. Minutes later, that same camera caught footage of Elle returning to school grounds alone. He re-entered his classroom and sat in his usual spot. His classmates noted that he behaved normally, playing and laughing throughout the rest of the day. When Joaquin didn't return home, his parents contacted the school's headmaster. When they learned that their son hadn't even attended any of his classes, the Speranis immediately reported him missing. Investigators quickly found Joaquin's bicycle, which was still chained up outside the school, yet there was no trace of the boy anywhere. After talking with members of staff, one eagle-eyed teacher mentioned that their student, Elle, had been using a different cell phone to the one he typically carried. Elle was questioned by detectives shortly thereafter, and they quickly determined that the boy's new cell phone was actually Joaquin's. The case had been painted in an effort to disguise it. Elle claimed that Joaquin had given him the phone as a present before running away from home, apparently fed up with the school bullies. Frustrated with what they considered to be passive police work, the missing boy's neighbors and family members took to the streets and conducted their own investigation. On Sunday, July 2nd, a search party entered an abandoned house on 480 Sarmiento Street, just 100 meters from the school. One member recalled what they found. We were walking with two of Joaquin's cousins when we passed an abandoned house. We went inside, and as soon as we entered, we saw the corpse. The cousins started screaming. It was like a horror movie. After discovering the body, Elle confessed that he and Joaquin had gone to the house together. They had apparently gotten into an argument there. A fight broke out, and Elle killed Joaquin in self-defense. Thing is, Joaquin had suffered 18 blows to the head. At the crime scene, police found an iron pipe and a piece of concrete, both stained with blood. A lack of defensive wounds suggested that Joaquin had actually been caught unawares and struck from behind. Certain that there hadn't been any argument and that Joaquin's murder was actually premeditated, officers conducted a search of Elle's house. In the young boy's room, they found a stuffed animal with a piece of paper hidden inside. A note which bore Joaquin's name and that of another boy, along with the unsettling message: "Mum will soon forget about this." This discovery led Joaquin's family to fear that another classmate may have been Elle's next intended victim. Due to his age, Elle couldn't be prosecuted in Argentina. He was held in a juvenile detention center for 3 months before being released to live with his family. He'll face no further consequences for his actions. In the minds of many local residents, it's only a matter of time before he indulges in his twisted fantasies once again. Maintaining a good work-life balance can be challenging, especially when you're swamped with multiple projects. When I first started this channel, for instance, there never seemed to be enough hours in the day. But today's sponsor, Stamps.com, helped me to reclaim a lot of that precious time. Stamps.com is like a 24/7 post office in your pocket, streamlining all of your postage needs so you can focus on what really matters. With Stamps, you can handle mailing and shipping wherever you are, even on the go. All you need is a computer and a printer. They even send you a free scale to get started. Scheduling package pickups is a breeze through the Stamps.com dashboard, and they automatically tell you the cheapest and fastest shipping options from different carriers. It seamlessly connects with every major marketplace and shopping cart, giving you access to the USPS and UPS services you need, anytime, day or night. But my favourite thing about Stamps is the crazy discounts you can't find anywhere else, up to 89% off USPS and UPS rates. Whether you're a small business owner or running a multi-location organization, sign up at stamps.com/lazymasquerade for a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, free postage, and a free digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to stamps.com/lazymasquerade. Shrouded in secrecy, North Korea remains one of the most enigmatic places on Earth. The rogue nation has long been a magnet for the morbidly curious, in large part because her all-powerful leaders have such a tight grip over their subjects. They have full control over what people can and can't say, how they can and can't style their hair, even over who can and can't exist. One of the few ordinary North Koreans to improve their lot in life was Woo In-hee. Born in Kaohsiung, her exact date of birth remains a mystery, though it's believed she was born either in the late 1930s or early 1940s. Described by her family as a selfless, bubbly girl who loved to dance, a young In-hee spent the Korean War helping her relatives scrape by, and came close to losing her life several times as bombs struck her hometown. That tough childhood instilled in her a desire to live in the moment and chase her dreams. And so, after the conflict, In-hee moved to Pyongyang to pursue a career as an actress. Her charisma and good looks served her well, and just 1 year after arriving in the capital, In-hee landed the lead role in The Tale of Cheongkyang, catapulting her to instant stardom. She went on to feature in dozens of successful films, including The Girl from Diamond Mountain, a movie in which she portrayed a character through all the stages of her life, from childhood to old age. In-hee received numerous awards, was honoured with the prestigious title of the People's Actress, and was considered by many to be the most beautiful woman in the Hermit Kingdom, with a curvy figure, a round face, and a girl-next-door charm. Her remarkable achievements drew the personal interest of many powerful individuals, not least the future Supreme Leader, Kim Jong-il. At that time, Kim was the second most powerful man in the country, just behind his father, and being both a fan of In-hee's work and beauty, Kim granted her the rare privilege of travelling to Czechoslovakia to study acting. In-hee would go on to marry Yoo Ho-sun, the most renowned movie director in the DPRK, and together the pair had 3 sons. They also had what we'd now call an open relationship. with Innie becoming involved with a number of her work colleagues. By the late 1970s, rumours about her many affairs had spread widely, leading to her workmates confronting her during a mutual criticism session, whatever that is. Innie defiantly pointed out that many of her accusers were themselves involved in the affairs, making them hypocrites and no better than her. What followed this session can only be described as a monumental fall from grace. Innie was stripped of her title as the People's Actress, blacklisted by the industry, and, since she was effectively owned by the studio, was assigned a punishing job tending the boiler room for 12 hours each day. In 1979, Innie was unexpectedly allowed to return to acting, and was even cast in leading roles again. Coincidentally, it was around that time that she began a new affair with her secret admirer, one Kim Jong-il. It's widely believed that in exchange for her body, Kim offered to restore Innie's career. Innie did agree to Kim's proposal, though in reality, it's hard to know whether their relationship was consensual. After all, refusing the heir apparent would have likely meant death, or even worse, life in a labour camp. Taking one look at this potato, I'm more inclined to believe that Innie felt forced into the deal. Well, willingly or not, Innie would covertly meet with Kim at his request. Once he was satisfied, Kim would remind Innie to keep her lips firmly sealed. Nobody could know that their future leader was an adulterer. Well aware of the potential consequences if she blabbed, Innie promised to never speak a word of their affair, not even to her own husband, Ho-sung. To be on the safe side, Kim had another actor shadow her and report on her activities. She would be monitored for the rest of her life. After her relationship with Kim, Innie fell madly in love with a young Zainichi Korean who had moved to the DPRK for work. She was initially hesitant to date the man, fearful of what may happen if Kim were to find out, but the Zainichi eventually won her over. Since it was too risky to meet in public, they spent their time together driving around in his Mercedes. In the winter of 1980, the pair were discovered in that same car. The engine was running, and they were both suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning. The man was pronounced dead at the scene. His name has never been made public. Innie miraculously survived and spent 2 weeks recovering in hospital. She was approached by the police while still in a disoriented and distraught state, and was subsequently forced to give a witness statement in which she let slip her belief that Kim Jong-il had tried to have her killed, citing their past romance as the motive. In her mind, Kim was either too jealous to let her move on, or feared that she would eventually make their affair public knowledge. Trouble was, she just had. After being held for several weeks in an undisclosed prison, Innie was told that she was free to go. Smiling, she was led through a set of heavy-duty doors. Ones that didn't lead onto the street, but rather onto the Kangkon shooting grounds. Before she could ask any questions, Innie was tied to a post in front of a crowd of 6,000 spectators. In the front row was Kim Jong-il. He had ordered Innie to be executed for revealing details about their affair. 12 gunmen then fired 10 rounds each at her from their AK-47s, mutilating her body beyond recognition. Her husband, Ho-sung, was forced to witness the proceedings. Following her death, Kim annulled Innie and Ho-sung's marriage and forced the bereaved husband to star in the propaganda film Unsung Heroes. The 6,000 attendees who had been forced to watch the event were all ordered to remain silent, for if they spoke about what they had seen, they would face the same fate as Innie. Despite that warning, the incident soon became common knowledge. In an effort to destroy not only her body, but also any evidence of her existence, Innie's name and image were systematically erased from magazines and film catalogues, and she was edited out of the films that she had starred in. In some cases, her scenes were reshot with a different actress, and in others, her scenes were deleted entirely, rendering their plots incomprehensible. Given that she only enjoyed fame within North Korea, Kim Jong-il's erasing of Innie was hugely successful, with later generations believing her existence to be nothing more than a myth. Indeed, this once household name may well have been deleted from the annals of history, had director Shin Sang-ok not managed to smuggle a photo of her out of the country. Sang-ok was a South Korean who was abducted by Kim Jong-il in 1978 and forced to make movies for him. But the wily filmmaker refused to let Kim have the last laugh. He made secret audio recordings of his conversations with Kim, which further exposed his tyrannical nature. And thankfully, Sang-ok was able to escape the country in 1986 with his wife. In 1988, he released a book, one titled The Kingdom of Kim Jong-il. It was published in South Korea and Japan. One section tells the story of Woo In-hee, and that page's accompanying picture, a still frame from the tale of Chongyang, is one of the last images of the actress that exists today. As you can probably guess from his name, Count Xavier Dupont de Ligons came from an aristocratic family, with his lineage including musketeers and even a castle in central France. Born with a silver spoon in his mouth, he rubbed shoulders with other noble children while growing up in Versailles, a wealthy suburb of Paris and the former haunt of kings and queens. Xavier met his future wife, Agnès, in the early 1980s, when he was 20 and she was 17. Though not as highborn as Xavier, Agnès came from a traditional, conservative background and held many of the same values as him. The pair quickly fell in love. However, the adventurous Xavier wanted to explore new horizons while he was still young. Thus he broke up with Agnès and left to travel the world, a decision he soon came to regret. 1 year later, he returned to Versailles to find that Agnès was pregnant with another man's child. To his family's surprise, Xavier chose to marry Agnès and adopt her child, Arthur, giving him the prestigious Dupont de Ligons name. Marrying an unwed mother was nearly unheard of in Versailles at the time, but the couple went on to build a loving family in the city of Nantes, welcoming 3 more children into the world: Thomas, Anne, and Benoit. In 2011, the family were living at 55 Robert Schumann Boulevard, a modest house in an upper-middle-class neighborhood. Xavier was known to be a devoted father who was deeply involved in his children's lives. They were all enrolled in either prestigious universities or private schools, and from the outside looking in, the Duponts were living the perfect, privileged life. Yet despite keeping up appearances, Xavier was harboring a dark secret. His wealth was quickly running out. Having always relied on the family's coffers growing up, he had never had to make his own living. So now, as a fully grown man, he had no idea how to. When asked what he did for work, he'd describe himself as a salesman, though always stayed vague with the details. He had started numerous businesses over the years, that much was true, but none of them had been successful. Between 2001 and 2011, he was in a, quote, downward spiral of failure, and was being hounded by debt collectors. This was playing havoc on the now middle-aged man's mind. Concerned, Agnès took to the online medical chat forum, Doctissimo, where she described how Xavier had subtly commented, "A group death as a family wouldn't be a catastrophe." Ominous. At around 2 p.m. on April 11th, 2011, a neighbor noted that the Dupont family's house, which was typically full of life and noise, had been eerily silent for about a week. She tried to peer through the windows, but the shutters had been pulled. A note on their letterbox read, "Return all mail to sender." All of the family's cars were still outside the house, except for their Citroën C5. But if they'd gone on holiday, she thought, that vehicle wouldn't have been large enough to carry all 6 family members, their 2 Labradors, and their luggage. Over the next 2 days, that same neighbor observed the house and grew increasingly concerned, prompting her to contact the police. On April 30th, officers arrived to investigate. Everything appeared normal inside the residence, though some of the beds had their sheets removed and a few closets were open. The police initially believed that the family had left voluntarily and saw no immediate cause for alarm. The following day, several friends and relatives received letters from Xavier and Agnes, ones which read, "As you know, I've had connections with the US. The Americans have recruited me to infiltrate an international drug ring. This will be difficult. You won't see us for a long while, as we're going to change our identities, be under protection, and won't be reachable at all." Now that was ominous. However, due to Xavier's esteemed status, many of his frankly eccentric loved ones believed the story outlined in the letter to be true. Agnes's family was far more skeptical. They forwarded the letter to the district attorney, adamant that she would have never left without calling them. The police returned to the family home 4 more times to conduct a more thorough investigation, but noticed nothing particularly suspicious, aside from some missing items. However, during their 6th visit on April 21st, a lieutenant discovered something under the terrace in the garden. Large plastic trash bags, bound with tape. Inside the bags were several bodies, wrapped in blankets and duvets. One grave contained Agnes, Arthur, Anne, Benoit, and the family dogs. Thomas' body was found in a separate hole. Xavier's was nowhere to be found. Though the exact date is contested, it's believed that Agnes, Arthur, Anne, and Benoit were all slain in the early hours of April 4th. Later that day, Xavier called his son, Thomas, at university, and told him, "Your mother's had a cycling accident. She's in the hospital, in a coma. We don't know if she'll come out of it. You'll have to come home." Upon his return, Xavier took Thomas out for dinner to discuss matters. Waiters at that restaurant recalled that near the end of their meal, Thomas had become noticeably sick. An autopsy revealed that all of the children had sleeping pills in their systems, so it's possible Xavier had slipped a sedative into his son's drink. The victims were found in their pajamas, suggesting that they were killed while sleeping in their beds. Strangely, there was no trace of blood in any of the bedrooms, nor in the living room, the foyer, or the bathroom. When crime scene investigators collected samples, they found no fingerprints or DNA on anyone. All 5 of them had been shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber rifle, though, strangely again, none of their neighbors reported hearing loud bangs during the night. 3 months before the murders, Xavier's father had passed away. His dad too had blown all of his money, but Xavier took it upon himself to clear out his father's apartment, perhaps in search of some valuables that he could sell. While doing so, he discovered his father's .22 caliber rifle. Prior to inheriting it, he'd shown no interest in weapons at all. After acquiring it, however, he began learning how to shoot. He even took 2 of his sons to the range, where he asked the instructor several questions, including one about using a silencer. Needless to say, Xavier was determined to be the prime suspect in the familicide. An international arrest warrant was issued for him, and detectives began scouring hotels and restaurants across France. Experts were able to build a timeline of events leading up to the slayings, one which highlighted just how thorough Xavier had been in his preparations. He had closed all of the family's bank accounts, bought a shovel and several bags of lime from different stores, had terminated Agnes' employment, and unenrolled his children from their respective schools and colleges. After the family's lives ended, Xavier remained in the house for a week before going on the run, bouncing from hotel to hotel. On April 22nd, they found the missing man's car in the parking lot of a Formula One hotel in Roquebrune-sur-Argens. After poring through the building's security footage, they came across something disturbing. The last known images of Xavier Dupont, captured on April 15th as he was checking out of the hotel. The footage showed him walking away into the wilderness, looking back as if to acknowledge the camera. This still was released to the public. So, what happened to Xavier? Well, it's worth noting that the area he was last seen in is surrounded by cliffs and mountains, leading many to believe that Xavier ended his own existence there. The police spent several weeks searching holes, caves, and crevices in the area, but found no trace of the aristocrat anywhere. Some people speculate that Xavier outwitted everyone and successfully escaped overseas. In most cases of familicide, the perpetrator typically ends their own life on the spot, not a week and a half later. Xavier put considerable effort into deceiving the investigators at the crime scene, perhaps to buy himself more time. Some believe he managed to trick them twice. First, by cleverly hiding his family's remains, and then by making it appear as if he had leapt from a cliffside. Records show that he didn't purchase any plane or train tickets in his own name, but Xavier could have easily taken a boat or used a highway or mountain path to reach Italy. He was multilingual and cosmopolitan, and could easily have started life anew in a foreign country. He was of average height and had no strong facial features, and would have found it simple to blend in near most anywhere. Other people, like Xavier's sister, Christine, are adamant that the bodies found under the terrace weren't actually Agnes and the Dupont children. In 2012, she told the media, "Xavier and his family left for the United States because their safety was threatened in France. The bodies found under the patio can't be those of Agnes and the children." Though that theory does sound outlandish, it is strange that the victims' remains were cremated extremely quickly, just a few short days after they had been discovered and examined. There were also supposed discrepancies between the heights and weights of the victims found at the home and those of the family members. Though the bodies shared the same common DNA, no samples were compared with the living members of the Dupont family to confirm their identities. That could all be chalked up to police incompetence, but several witnesses, including the family's neighbors and friends, attest that they had either seen or been in contact with Agnes and the children 4 or 5 days after they had supposedly been slain. Employing Occam's razor, the authorities' working theory remains that Xavier did kill his family in order to save face. He was known to be a vain and proud man who would do anything to avoid being exposed as a failure, and they believe he wanted to prevent his children from discovering that he was broke. He then either ended himself in the wilderness or jumped into the sea. In October 2019, a man suspected of being Xavier was arrested at Glasgow Airport in Scotland. His fingerprints partially matched Xavier's, but DNA testing confirmed he wasn't a missing aristocrat. Despite 900 other alleged sightings, Xavier Dupont-Pelagon has never been found. Today, over a decade after vanishing, he remains a wanted suspect. Before we end, a huge thank you to my supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon, especially my biggest supporters: Cool Dude Organ, George Lopez, Holly Lyons, Modest Bulbasaur, Alana Pons, Asia Mina, Azrael Warrior, Chief Kochuaki, Colin Monsma, Connell Loughlin, Sai Wazal, Panzerus Puppers, Farewell Tattoos Jack Sefel, Gina Valera, Grace Archie, Hamish, Ian Bullock, Misty Blue Longy, Peter Loddrach, TNS Mo, Terry Ford, Hamish K, LJB, Itai Allen, and Nefus1988. Thank you so much for your continued support.
Weird history stories aren't always stories that were seen as weird at the time. As time goes on, things that were once considered normal can suddenly become extremely unusual. However, these weird history stories go beyond cultural norms changing. In February of 1637, the price of tulip bulbs in the Netherlands plummeted. People who had been betting on the price increasing lost everything. The collapse impacted every aspect of society, and many Dutch merchants found themselves bankrupt. The real history behind tulip mania wasn't quite as drastic as it was later made out to be. The Dutch economy wasn't destroyed, and the people who lost the most money were the ones that could afford it. But the strange tale of how a bulb could be worth as much as a house is just as weird. In the early 1600s, the Dutch economy was going from strength to strength. The country had just become independent from Spain, and merchants from the Dutch East India Company were bringing back exotic plants and spices, and other things from Asia. Among these were tulips, which are actually native to Kazakhstan. Tulips were very rare. Even rarer were tulips infected with a virus that caused the unusual solid colors on the petals to become striped. They were considered the most beautiful and were a symbol of significant wealth. Once the flowers became seen as something only the wealthy could afford, the price was driven up. Paying over the odds for something because you believe someone will pay even more isn't a new phenomenon, and this is where tulip mania began. While some accounts claim everyone from nobles to chimney sweeps were caught up in tulip mania, it was only really the richest in society. Many saw the entire thing as foolish, and satirical pieces were written about it, which later historians would take to be serious. The price of tulip bulbs were exceedingly high, though. It wasn't uncommon for a bulb to cost as much as what a skilled worker would earn in a year. The most expensive bulb we actually have records of cost 5,200 guilders, 20 times the annual salary of a skilled worker. But this seems to have been very rare. The bubble burst in 1637. Whether it was because people decided they didn't want to spend that much for a flower, or if an influx of bulbs meant they weren't rare anymore is unknown. The economy didn't end up in shambles, and there aren't actually any records of anyone losing their businesses. What was more of an issue is that a lot of trade at the time was done on promises to buy later. These promises were always upheld, but when the bubble burst, people who had promised to pay hundreds for bulbs would no longer do so. This break in cultural norms was much more significant, though it's usually overlooked when this period of weird history is remembered today. Frederick Wilhelm Voigt is a folklore hero whose life has inspired plays, films, and TV shows, and whose waxwork figure is in the Madame Tussauds Museum. Unlike other figures that have risen to his level of fame, Voigt was not a political figure. He didn't achieve his fame through music or the arts and wasn't born into royalty. He was a criminal, but one whose real history has captured people's imaginations over the years. It was even admired by a German emperor. Voigt was born in 1849 in East Prussia, the son of a shoemaker. He was supposed to go into the same profession as his father, and he did, but Voigt had other plans on how to make money. Between 1860 and 1890, Voigt was in and out of prison, having begun a career of theft, fraud, and false statements. It was nothing too serious, and he probably would have been forgotten if not for his most audacious crime at the start of the 20th century. It was October of 1906. Somehow, Voigt had acquired the uniform of an army captain in Berlin. He went to a nearby town and approached a troop of soldiers. These soldiers had never seen him before, but believed Voigt when he told them that he was an army captain, and marched them 20 miles to the town of Copenhagen. According to Voigt, the mayor of the town was to be arrested, and the town's assets seized. Of course, the mayor hadn't done anything wrong, but the troops were obedient to the man that they thought was their army officer. The troops stormed the mayor's office and arrested him. Voigt demanded to see the cash box, which contained the town's funds. He confiscated the 4,000 marks inside, which is worth roughly $30,000 in today's money. The Copenhagen mayor was taken to Berlin. After hours at the police station, the police and army realized that the whole thing had been a trick. By this point, Voigt was already long gone. The German people found the story amusing, as did Kaiser Wilhelm II. But the army wasn't as happy about being made to look like idiots. It didn't take them long to track Voigt down, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. The Kaiser himself pardoned Voigt after just 2 years, though. Voigt spent the rest of his life earning money from his infamy. He did work for a brief time as a shoemaker, but also wrote a memoir about his life, starred in shows about himself, including shows in the US and Canada, and posed for pictures in an army officer's uniform. He would pass away in 1922 and was buried in the Notre Dame Cemetery, where his grave is frequently visited by tourists who leave coins to honor him. As Halloween of 1944 approached, the Canadian government had a real-life zombie problem to contend with. There were thousands of zombies unhappy about speculation that they might be sent overseas to fight in the European theaters of the Second World War. At the same time, the general public were equally unhappy that the zombies weren't being sent. While the idea of modern media depictions of zombies going to fight the Axis powers sounds like a bad video game, Canada's zombie army was a real period of weird history. At the time, zombies hadn't gotten the monster image we think of today. It was still a term very much tied to historical traditions, and would most often refer to a mindless, obedient servant. Somehow, the word became used to describe conscripted men who refused to fight overseas. During the First World War, conscription had been a divisive issue in Canada, and the government in the 1940s were trying to avoid it happening again. Conscription still went into place, but only people who volunteered to fight overseas would be sent abroad. The others would work in administrative roles in Canada, or defending the Canadian coasts. At first, this wasn't much of a problem. Using predictions made on British casualties, the army knew how many recruits it needed to train for different roles and had enough volunteers to make sure they had enough troops in Europe. But as the fighting became more intense, they realized the calculations they'd been using were wrong. Not enough men were being trained. At home, the tensions between the men labeled as zombies and general servicemen were becoming worse and worse. In 1943, a riot broke out when general servicemen sang a song called "Salute to a Zombie" at a group of men who refused to fight overseas. Canada was split on the subject of whether young men should be forced into the horrific landscape that was Western Europe at the time. English Canadians were generally for this conscription, while French Canadians were generally against it. In October of 1944, the situation was almost at a breaking point. The Prime Minister hired a recently retired army officer as his defense minister to try to convince conscripts to volunteer to fight. But the plan failed. In November, plans to send 17,000 zombies to fight in Europe were put into place. Thankfully, the fighting became lighter that winter, and the casualty numbers dropped back to a manageable rate. About 2,500 were sent, and 69 lost their lives. The early to mid-11th century was an extremely weird period in history for the Catholic Church. The position of Pope was not just a religious role, but a person who held secular power, and making sure that they had the right man for the job was extremely important. However, it wasn't something that was often treated with that much importance. In 1032, one of the most controversial popes in history rose to power. Benedict IX was born into a powerful noble family that held a lot of political power in Italy. He was the nephew of two popes, and when Pope Benedict VIII passed away in 1032, his father had put him in charge. How old he was at this point is disputed. A historic writing close to that time period claimed he was just 12 years old, though he could have been as old as 20. What is certain is that he wasn't at all prepared for the role. Benedict was known to steal from the church, taking the lives of his political opponents, committing adultery, and breaking other church laws in his time as pope. At one point, he fled Rome after political opponents tried to take his life, but the Holy Roman Emperor put him back in power. Most people at the time agreed that this was a bad decision. One of the cardinals described him as a demon from hell disguised as a priest. In 1045, the people of Rome chased him out of the city, and a new pope was elected. But 2 months later, Benedict returned and deposed his short-lived successor. Another 2 months passed, and Benedict changed his mind. He wanted to marry his cousin, which he couldn't do as pope, so he let his godfather buy the papacy from him. Benedict was free to marry his cousin, who then rejected him. Naturally, Benedict wanted the papacy back, but it wasn't going to be as easy as it had been the first time. The Holy Roman Emperor had passed away some years earlier, and a new one couldn't be crowned without a legitimate pope. Henry III of Germany was trying to get himself crowned and needed to sort out the papacy. He had Benedict, his godfather, and another man who was claiming the position dismissed, and instead had his personal confessor installed as Pope Clement II. Clement lasted almost a year before he passed away. At this point, Benedict jumped on the opportunity and had himself crowned for a third time. But Henry III's army drove him out after a few months. What happened after this point is uncertain, but Benedict opted to not try for a fourth term in power. Some say he spent the rest of his life repenting for his sins, while others claimed he kept doing the same things that he had done as Pope. The papacy after that settled down, leaving behind the weird history for the time being. There would be other strange historical moments, but none would quite match what Benedict IX managed to achieve. The London beer flood of 1814 was exactly what it sounds like. This piece of weird history is largely forgotten, but had a large impact on beer breweries in the decades afterwards. The Moo & Company's Horseshoe Brewery was located in the neighborhood of St. Giles. It was a poor neighborhood which had become home to many Irish people who had relocated to London. Poverty and crime was high. In 1810, the brewery company had installed a 22-foot-tall wooden fermentation tank. It was able to hold over 3,500 barrels and was held together with multiple iron rings. 2 or more times a year, one of the rings would break and need to be replaced. But it had never caused a problem before. It was the mid-afternoon on October 17th. Most of the men that lived in the crowded houses that surrounded the brewery were at work, leaving only women and young children home when the disaster occurred. At around 4:30 p.m., a storehouse clerk noticed that one of the iron rings had broken. He informed his boss, but was told it wouldn't be an issue, and to inform someone to come fix it at a later date. The clerk went on with his work until about an hour later, when he heard a massive eruption from the storeroom. The pressure from the fermentation tank had been too much for the remaining rings, and the tank was now nothing more than 1 million splinters of wood. Gallons of hot beer had toppled the wall of the brewery, and the force of the eruption was so much that the other tanks and barrels had burst open. The beer caused a 15-foot tsunami of alcohol to pour into the surrounding streets. Given it was such a poor neighborhood, there was no drainage system, and the alcohol flooded the basements of houses. 2 houses collapsed due to the damage. In all, 8 people lost their lives in the disaster. Strangely, it became somewhat of a macabre attraction in the days afterward, with people paying a few pennies to look at the wreckage of the brewery. Of course, the free alcohol also attracted people, and there were unconfirmed reports of a 9th person losing his life due to alcohol poisoning. The accident was determined to be an act of God, so the brewery didn't have to pay any compensation. The incident did lead to wooden tanks being phased out, with concrete vats becoming more commonplace. Weirdly, this wouldn't be the only tidal wave of alcohol in British history. In 1906, something similar happened at a whiskey distillery in Glasgow. It wasn't until the mid-1800s that scientists realized some of the strange fossils of ancient humans weren't our ancestors, but another branch of human evolution that we could have gone down. These were Neanderthals, named after Neander Valley, where the species was first identified. Since their discovery, our understanding of this ancient human species has evolved significantly, but there are still many mysteries we don't understand. One of the largest and ever-evolving is the cause of their extinction roughly 40,000 years ago. Scientists believe there were at least 9 hominid species that once existed on Earth. Not all would have interacted with Homo sapiens, modern humans. Some are only found in fossils from the islands of Indonesia, and likely would never have come across our own ancient ancestors. But others would have interacted with us a lot. The manner of this interaction is something that researchers are still trying to understand. One species we know interacted with Homo sapiens a fair amount was the Neanderthals. This is the one hominid species we know the most about, other than sapiens, but that's still not very much. It's believed they lived around Europe and Western Asia between 400,000 years ago up until 40,000 years ago. Popular images of these ancient people depict them as unintelligent and aggressive. It's assumed that humans were simply able to defeat them with our superior intellect. But more recent studies into the remains of Neanderthals and their settlements show a species that was a lot more like us than we once thought. When it comes to appearance, there are some obvious differences. The Neanderthals had spent thousands of years adapting to the harsh climates further north, even surviving the Ice Age. That leads to them being shorter and stockier than their Homo sapien cousins. Their rib cages were shorter, wider, and deeper, and they had larger musculature to help them hunt Ice Age animals. They also had larger eyes, which may have been an adaptation to allow them to hunt during the longer winter nights. But their brains were roughly the same size as Homo sapiens. The brain power of Neanderthals is still hotly debated among experts. Some have suggested that their larger eyes and heavier bodies would have required more processing power, so there wouldn't have been as much room for complex problem solving as in sapiens. But there is evidence of that complex thought. Neanderthals used tools, and the oldest found bone tool was actually created by the species. There's also evidence that they developed trinkets that were meant for decorative purposes. Some of the ancient cave art might have been created by Neanderthals, and we know that they likely used animal hides for clothes. It's even believed that they created some kind of foot covering. But if it wasn't a lack of intelligence that led to the Neanderthals going extinct, what was it? This is an extremely difficult question to answer. Scientists have pointed out that figuring out why modern animal species are going extinct can be difficult. So answering this question about a species that we know very little about is even harder. Pinpointing exactly when it happened has also been difficult for researchers. The latest estimate is that it was between 41,000 and 39,000 years ago. But that's moved about a lot as new scientific techniques have led to better radiocarbon dating techniques. It's believed that most Neanderthals had been wiped out before the eruption of the supervolcano Campiflagre in Italy, roughly 39,000 years ago. This eruption coated much of Eastern Europe, North Africa, and West Asia in a layer of ash, and there don't seem to be any Neanderthal remains found above that layer. Scientists have speculated that there may have been small pockets that survived up until this point, but the general Neanderthal population had disappeared. But that estimate of roughly 40,000 years ago leaves tens of thousands of years where humans and Neanderthals coexisted in Europe. It wasn't a case of sapiens uprooting Neanderthals and quickly taking their place. There's even evidence that the opposite occurred sometimes. Archaeologists found a settlement in southern France that with Homo sapien tools and a tooth dated to 54,000 years ago. It's believed that Neanderthals lived there for roughly 20,000 years before a roughly 2,000-year period where Homo sapiens lived there. The Homo sapiens later disappeared and the site was unoccupied for a while before Neanderthals returned. It seems unlikely this wasn't a violent overthrow by Homo sapiens, but it might have been that sapiens were simply able to outcompete our Neanderthal cousins for resources, especially in more difficult conditions. One key difference between the two species is the level of social networking. Neanderthals stayed in small groups. Flint from the tools they used typically came from the local area, but humans were able to sustain larger social networks. The material from their tools could originate far away from where the tools were found, showing a level of cooperation that wasn't seen in Neanderthals. If food in one area was scarce, humans would have been able to trade with neighbors from other areas, while Neanderthals didn't have that ability. Another more recent theory suggests that disease could have played a key role in wiping out the Neanderthals. When sapiens and Neanderthals first came into contact, they would have had entirely different diseases, which the other group wouldn't have had any resistance to. According to models, the two groups would have been able to coexist with limited interactions for a while, with the disease barrier between them. Over time, the groups would gradually build up tolerances to the other's diseases. Children born from Neanderthal and Homo sapien parents would have sped up the process. Once humans were able to tolerate Neanderthal diseases, they would be able to break through the disease barrier. Interacting with Neanderthals more would then make the northern species sick, but with little effect on the humans. Diseases would then quickly spread through Neanderthal groups and wipe them out. Other theories suggest it might have just been a numbers game. There were more Homo sapiens than Neanderthals. Any famine or disease that had an impact on the population of all human species would hurt the Neanderthals more. simply because they didn't have the numbers to recover. Mating between the two species would also limit the Neanderthals' numbers more than the Homo sapiens. It's also likely that a mixture of these reasons caused the extinction of this species. Neanderthals lived as far north as Belgium, south to the Mediterranean, west to Spain, and east to Asia. Events happening in one region might not have had an impact on other regions. Studies of lake sediments in Italy showed that the climate change that was happening in northern Europe wasn't having much of an impact here. So it could be that diseases had a greater impact in this region, while climate change and a lack of resources could have caused problems in more northern regions. Our understanding of Neanderthals is constantly evolving, with many earlier assumptions being overturned with new discoveries. It's possible that we may never get to the bottom of this mystery, with every new discovery only leading to more questions. But we've made significant progress. Understanding what happened to the Neanderthals and other hominin species might give us an insight into what could happen to other species, including our own. Today, the Greek island of Santorini is a popular holiday destination, boasting picturesque villages and good food. But these buildings are perched upon an active volcano, one that's the subject of a decades-old mystery. Santorini is possibly most famous for the destructive eruption that shook the eastern Mediterranean, sometime around 1600 BC. For centuries before then, the island had been home to a thriving Bronze Age culture. It was part of the Minoan sphere of influence, and is likely the most famous Minoan location outside the island of Crete. The largest settlement would have been the city of Akrotiri. The settlement would have come to an end in one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the Holocene epoch. The island had been built up over the course of hundreds of thousands of years by volcanic eruptions and caldera collapses. There had been some volcanic activity during human history, but it hadn't stopped people from making their homes on its slopes. But at some point around 1600 BC, the seismic activity hinted that something much more destructive was going to happen. The city of Akrotiri was abandoned, and the population relocated to other parts of the Mediterranean. And then the island erupted. The volcanic eruption would have been between a 7 and 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index. It threw ash and debris into the atmosphere that would have an impact around the world. Some scholars believe people as far away as China might have written about the yellow skies and strange weather caused by the ash. Akrotiri was completely encased in ash, giving future historians an insight into what life might have been like for the ancient Minoans. On top of the ash, tsunamis caused destruction on neighboring islands. Much of the island was destroyed in the eruption, and today the scars are clear to be seen in aerial photos. An eruption of this magnitude would have had an impact on the surrounding civilizations, and it may have even inspired the myth of Atlantis. But today, the eruption has a lasting impact on archaeology. The ash layer provided archaeologists with a marker that could be used to determine the age of other layers during archaeological digs. Artifacts found beneath the ash would have originated before the eruption, while those found above the ash would have been from afterwards. Given the time frame and location, this would be very useful for historians. Many of the most famous ancient civilizations would have been in this region. The only problem with this is that historians can't figure out when exactly the eruption took place. The first excavations of Akrotiri took place around 1967, following a theory that the destruction of Santorini was to blame for the destruction of Minoan palaces in Crete in 1450 BC. Originally, excavations didn't quite line up with this theory, but it seemed like the eruption could have been the beginning of the end for the Minoan civilization. Pottery is a very useful indicator for archaeologists, with different styles and practices going in and out of use. The type of pottery used in Akrotiri is a style known as Late Minoan 1A. Egypt's carefully kept chronology allows archaeologists to give a precise date for when artifacts were used in the Egyptian kingdom. The Late Minoan 1A pottery was found towards the end of the Egyptian New Kingdom, around 1500 BC. That put the destruction of Akrotiri roughly 50 years before the Minoan collapse. It was possible that the site was abandoned long before the eruption actually took place. We know that the city was definitely abandoned, as there were no human remains like those found at Pompeii. However, historians believe this would have only happened a few years at most before the eruption. The knock-on effects of the eruption might have caused the end of the Minoan civilization, but it wasn't caused directly by the eruption and tsunamis. For a long time, this date of 1500 BC was accepted by scholars, but more research has changed that theory. Radiocarbon dating gave new possible dates, which suggested that the eruption might have taken place up to 100 years before the 1500 BC assumption. Radiocarbon dating can be difficult to get right, with many people claiming it's downright inaccurate at times. There are natural fluctuations in the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and the calibration is ever changing as more information about the Earth's history is uncovered. But study after study found that trees, seeds, and animals preserved in the ash on Santorini had all passed away much earlier than 1500 BC. The most recent radiocarbon dating attempt placed the eruption of Santorini between 1609 and 1560 BC, with a 95.4% probability, and between 1606 and 1589, with a 68.3% probability. That estimation puts the eruption within Egypt's second intermediate period, and shortly after the end of the Old Babylonian Empire. Dating from tree rings and ice cores has also been used to try to get to the bottom of the mystery. Trees from Belfast in California were analyzed and found to have had narrow growth rings around 1630 BC, slightly earlier than the radiocarbon dating estimates. While tree rings do give a very precise year, the problem is that it's impossible to know for certain what causes the growth patterns. A volcanic winter would cause limited growth in Belfast, and possibly as far away as California. But there could be other reasons for this limited growth. There could have been other volcanic eruptions that might be responsible. The same problem arises when using ice cores to determine the date of volcanic eruptions. One ice core in Greenland seemed to have evidence that the eruption happened at a certain date, but it was determined that the ash couldn't have come from the Santorini eruption. At the moment, it appears that experts have more faith in the radiocarbon dating method than in using pottery in the Egyptian chronology to date the eruption. But that then leaves the question of how pottery from decades or even a century after the eruption was found at Santorini. It's possible this was due to problems in Egypt. The Egyptian intermediate periods weren't complete dark ages, but there were periods of significant upheaval when the pharaoh didn't have complete control over the kingdom. It's easy to imagine that trade with the outside world might not have been happening in the usual manner. So the pottery from Minoan civilizations didn't appear in the Egyptian record until much later, after the new kingdom was established. It could also be that the pottery found on Santorini was closer to prototypes of the style that will become fashionable decades later. For now, the answer of between 1609 and 1560 BC gives historians something to work with, but archaeologists and researchers continue to work to find a definitive answer to this problem. The study of alchemy dates back to Hellenistic Egypt and appears in ancient Indian and Chinese texts. In 1144, a Latin translation of an Arabic work reintroduced the topic to Europe. Throughout the medieval and into the early modern period, alchemy fascinated scholars as much as chemistry, physics, or any other natural science. Some of the texts from this period have survived, leaving modern viewers baffled as to what the symbols and cryptic poetry might be referring to. Of these texts, the Ripley Scroll may be one of the most mysterious. Sir George Ripley was a famous alchemist who lived in England between 1415 and 1490. He was a priest, author, and poet, and his writing went on to inspire the likes of John Dee and Isaac Newton. At the time, alchemy was seen as no different to any other sciences, and would make people like Newton famous. Unsurprisingly, Ripley wrote about the elusive and famous philosopher's stone. Even people without much interest in alchemy have heard of this supposed artifact. It was the primary goal of most alchemists, a stone or power which turned base metals into gold or silver. Some also believe it had rejuvenation or life-giving properties. It went by other names and was sometimes simply called the elixir. For alchemists of Ripley's time, it had an important connection with Christianity too. Only something pure was believed to have the ability to do what the stone could, and so the stone became a symbol of Jesus Christ. This would explain how Ripley and other alchemists could practice and study the art while continuing to practice their religion. Ripley wrote many works, including On the Stone, but the most famous piece attached to his name might not actually be by the famous alchemist. The Ripley Scroll is believed to have been created sometime in the 15th century. The original is lost today, but we do have around 21 copies, which were made between the mid-15th and early 16th century. The scrolls vary in size, but most are around 6 meters in length, which would have made it very difficult to display or read. There are a few different versions of the scroll, though most follow the same patterns with similar images. At the top of the scroll is an image of a bearded man, believed to be Hermes Trismegistus, a legendary Egyptian sage associated with the god Thoth. He stands over a large alchemical flask. In the flask, we see 7 images of people conducting alchemical experiments, and a drawing of the biblical Adam and Eve. In the center of these images are what appears to be an alchemist and a priest. Moving down through the scroll, Adam and Eve appear again, standing in a pool of water beside the tree of knowledge. Further down is the image of a dragon eating a frog, 2 lions beside a fire, and a golden phoenix. The penultimate image is that of the Philosopher's Stone, depicted as 3 orbs, 1 red, 1 white, and 1 black. The stone is held aloft by a dragon that seems to be eating its own tail. At the bottom of the scroll is another person holding a quill pen, as if this had all been written by the small figure. Throughout the scroll are pieces of poetry written by Ripley about the stone, which is why the work has been attributed to him. But the oldest versions of the Ripley Scroll do not have these verses, and it's possible these were added later to give the scroll more legitimacy. The images are shrouded in symbolism, and we can only guess at what the meanings were. The entire thing is believed to be a recipe for the stone itself. According to the British Library, Adam and Eve are supposed to represent sulfur and mercury, 2 ingredients that were essential to creating the white stone. Other interpretations see them representing the sun and the moon. The British Library describes the dragon eating the frog as symbolizing the spontaneous creation of the black stone. Even if the Philosopher's Stone were real, it's clear that our current understanding of the Ripley Scroll wouldn't be enough to follow the recipe and create the elixir. Putting aside the mystical nature of alchemy, there are still many unanswered questions about the scrolls. Researchers aren't certain what the scroll actually would have been used for. One theory was that they were used in alchemy shops as a form of advertisement, but the copies of the scroll we have today are in relatively good condition. They obviously weren't hanging in the open for any great period of time. They're also extremely long, which would make them unpractical in most places. But there are very few other reasons why this would appear in the form of one long scroll, rather than a folio or booklet. In the scroll form, it's impractical, and would have been difficult for anybody to view the entire piece easily. That may just have been part of the aesthetics of the scroll, though. It wasn't designed to be understood by most people. The images are deliberately cryptic, and only those with experience in alchemy or with similar texts would have been able to decipher the meaning. It could be that having it in this form, rather than something more easily readable, could have been another way to protect it from outsiders. Finding out who created the Ripley Scroll could help solve this mystery. Ripley wrote books on his studies into alchemy, and doesn't seem overly concerned about keeping alchemy a secret. There's nothing to prove for certain that this wasn't by him, though later writers who referenced Ripley's works didn't reference the scroll. It seems more likely his verses were attached to it later, possibly to add to its appeal, or to make things a little easier to understand. The truth of the Ripley Scroll remains shrouded in mystery. Medieval copies of the scroll have sold for hundreds of thousands of dollars at auction, but anybody wishing to crack the mystery can view the manuscript online. In the 1960s, workers at a quarry near Peterborough, England, came across buried pieces of ancient wood deep in the clay. It wasn't until the 1990s that they realized just what they had uncovered. Quarrying stopped immediately, and the investigation into this Bronze Age settlement began. The official name for this archaeological site is Must Farm, but the nickname, the Pompeii of the Fens, hints at just how significant a find this was. Sometime around 1250 BC, a settlement of around 8 round houses had been built around a slow-moving river in what is today Cambridgeshire. The houses were built on stilts and surrounded by a wooden wall or palisade. It would have been a tight-knit community and home to several individual families. Artifacts found within the home seemed to indicate that they were relatively wealthy. There were glass and amber beads from as far away as Syria and Turkey, as well as hordes of tools and weapons, textile covers for the walls and floors, and an abundance of food. The people here kept lambs, but there was also evidence of agriculture and hunting. They may have even enjoyed honey-glazed venison, as both honey and deer meat were found together on some artifacts recovered from the site. They also had dogs that ate scraps from the humans. But life at Must Farm was suddenly turned upside down in a devastating blaze. Archaeologists believe it would have happened in the late summer or autumn, judging by the age of the lambs whose remains were recovered. It happened so quickly, the people living there didn't have any time to take cherished belongings or even rescue the dogs. They fled from the houses before the roofs collapsed and plunged the whole building into the river below. In what would have been a short amount of time, the entire settlement was destroyed. The soft silt of the riverbed cushioned the fall. The oxygen-starved conditions perfectly preserved the remains, which were then covered by meters of silt and clay and forgotten to history. By the time archaeologists were able to excavate the site, only the remains of 4 of the round houses were preserved. It's believed at least another 4 had existed before they were destroyed by quarrying. But these 4 houses still provided valuable insight into what life would have been like for people in Bronze Age Britain. There are a few Bronze Age sites that have been found in Britain, though it seems that archaeological sites from the later Iron Age are much more common. We know relatively little about the people who lived in Britain centuries before the Romans arrived. The Bronze Age sites we do have typically aren't well preserved. Rather than wooden posts, there's just evidence of places where those posts would have been. Archaeologists described finding a couple of shards of pottery or a pit with animal bones as getting really lucky. So the discovery of the Pompeii of the Fens was exceptional. This was the sort of discovery that enabled experts to learn more about this important era in British history, but also proposed new questions that we still can't answer. One of the biggest questions that we have about the Pompeii of the Fens was why it was destroyed. Archaeologists were able to determine that it had only been built 9 months to a year previously. There was a lack of occupational waste which would have been present if the site had been settled for a long time. The wood that was being used to build the structure was also described as green when it was burned, meaning it had only recently been cut down. There was also a lack of burrowing insects in the woods, which would have taken a long time to make their homes in the logs, especially considering the environment of the Fens. So if it had only been built for less than a year, how or why was it destroyed? Experts believe it was unlikely that it was an accidental fire. There would have been hearths in each of the round houses, likely in the center, with easy access to an opening to let out smoke. But these people would have been used to living in wood houses, so they knew how to have hearths operating without leading to a disaster. It also seems unlikely that something like this would have been able to rip through the entire settlement so quickly that people weren't able to stop it, or even collect belongings. We know the fire happened quickly. Food was found still in pots being cooked. In one bowl, filled with a porridge-like food, still had a wooden spoon inside. This sudden abandonment is one of the reasons why the settlement earned its Pompeii nickname. It truly was a single moment in time, captured and preserved for thousands of years. All of the humans in the settlement managed to escape, but they left behind lambs, which would have been particularly valuable. The remains of dogs were also located. The only human remains found at the site was a female skull, but it's believed this had been from someone who passed away long before the fire. It may have been an ancestor and a keepsake belonging to one of the inhabitants. This sort of artifact would have been irreplaceable, and it would have been one of the things the owner would have wanted to save if possible. For this reason, it seems unlikely this was a deliberate fire set by the settlers. There are incidents in other ancient settlements of houses being burned down by the owners and later rebuilt, but that wasn't the case here. One theory is that the settlement was deliberately destroyed by attackers. The palisade built around the settlement and the hordes of weapons that were located inside seem to suggest that the people were, at the very least, trying to keep someone or something outside of the settlement. This might have been why it was built over water in the first place, to make it even harder for attackers to get through. This could be a sign that the settlement was built in hostile territory, though we know that the settlers would have traded with and interacted with the outside world. As well as beads from the continent, some of the meat found at the site belonged to animals that didn't live in the Finn area. Just how much the people of Must Farm interacted with other locals is another mystery. If the settlement was deliberately destroyed by attackers, this could explain why it was never resettled. There's no evidence of any recovery efforts taking place, or any other settlement being built in this area. This wasn't the first time something had been built over the river here. Archaeologists found evidence of even more ancient sites that were already destroyed and rotting by the time the Must Farm settlers began to build. But the site seems to have been completely abandoned. That could be because the settlers decided it was too dangerous to stay in this area, or because whoever set the fire to the settlement wouldn't allow them to return. A forensic fire investigator was brought to the scene to see if the mystery of how the fire was started could be solved. The investigator believed it was possible that the fire had been deliberately set, but there was nothing to say for certain that this was the answer. It's possible that evidence for the attack might have been found in one of the round houses that were destroyed before archaeologists took over the site. Despite this mystery, the site provided a fascinating insight into the Bronze Age Britain, and might someday help to answer more questions about what life was like 3,000 years ago. Throughout human history, there are instances of myths and legends being attached to historical figures. Sometimes these can obscure the truth, but eventually, archaeologists and historians are able to get to the bottom of reality. But that isn't always the case. The story of Queen Semiramis of Assyria is one such case where the legends and myths still shroud the true history. It wasn't until generations later that the story of Semiramis was told, and the most complete version of her story comes from Greek historians. In the legendary story, Semiramis was the daughter of a fish goddess and immortal. After she was born, her mother disappeared to the bottom of the lake, and Semiramis was abandoned. The child was found by doves who stole milk from a local shepherd family and looked after the infant. An abandoned child being looked after by animals is a trope that appears often in mythologies from this region. But doves were a unique element to Semiramis' story. She was eventually found by the royal shepherd, who raised her. Semiramis was described as having a divine beauty as well as great intelligence. She was later married to one of the king's advisors, a man named Anis. The king in this tale is Ninus of Assyria. According to Greek historians, Ninus was the founder of Nineveh, who conquered what is today the Middle East. It was on one of his campaigns that Semiramis caught his attention. Ninus sought advice from Anis, who revealed that many of his strategies had actually come from his wife. With Semiramis' help, Ninus was victorious. He wished to marry Semiramis and offered Anis his own daughter as a trade. Anis didn't want to let her go, but Ninus threatened to destroy him, and he relented. Semiramis became Ninus' queen and continued to aid his conquests. They had a son together, Ninus, but he was still young when Ninus passed away. Semiramis then took control of the empire, leading many campaigns. Some versions of the story have her pretending to be her own son in order to gain the support of the nobles and the army, while in other versions she simply ruled in her own right. Semiramis was an even more fearsome ruler than her husband, and she spread the empire further east into Asia, as well as taking Egypt and going as far south as Ethiopia. When it came to India, she had fake elephants constructed to try to scare the Indian armies. But when it came time to do battle, Semiramis was severely wounded and had to retreat. She managed to escape, cutting the bridge behind her to stop the advancing army. While on her travels, she sought advice from the Oracle of Ammon, who told her that her own son would be her undoing. That would come true after the campaign across the Indus. Ninus was now an adult, and he plotted to take the throne back. After ruling for 42 years, Semiramis abdicated in favor of her son, and her story ended with her disappearing into obscurity. She would later be associated with various gods, and later versions of the story claimed she even invented polytheism. Semiramis would also later be associated with the biblical Nimrod and the construction of the Tower of Babel. Semiramis was said to have embarked on many construction projects during her reign. The ancient works across from Turkey to the Indus Valley have been associated with her. The truth of Semiramis is much less fantastical, and unfortunately, less clear. Semiramis was born around 850 BC. We don't know where she was born, but it was likely somewhere around the Levant or in Assyria itself. Later scholars claim that she'd been a Babylonian princess, or from some more distant location. She would eventually meet and marry the Neo-Assyrian king, Shamshi-Adad V, and became his chief wife. Shamshi-Adad V ruled from 824 to 811. and unfortunately, very little survives about Semiramis during his reign. It wasn't until after he passed away that she became more prominent. When Shamshi Adad passed, his son, Adad Nirari III, was still very young. This was a period of great political turmoil. While Shamshi Adad's conquests were nowhere near the legendary campaigns of Ninus, he'd spent much of his rule out on military campaigns. His rule had even started with a revolt against the previous king, and it's likely that there was a fear something similar might happen with a young king on the throne. Semiramis took over ruling in her son's stead. Unfortunately, records of what she did during this time have been lost. Historians aren't even clear what her official role was. There's debate over whether she co-ruled with the young king, or if she simply ruled in his place. It's believed she continued to use the title of queen rather than queen regent, and inscriptions seem to indicate that she became more prominent during this period than during her time actually being married to the king. She may also have gone on military campaigns with her son. Adad Nirari took over and began ruling in his own right in 808 BC. That would mean that whatever Semiramis' reign actually looked like, it only lasted for about 3 years rather than the 42 of legend. Like in the legendary version of this story, the end of Semiramis' story is unknown. She appears to have faded out of public life and passed into obscurity. There are many parts of Semiramis' story that remain a mystery. With our current archaeological findings, it's impossible to tell what parts of the Semiramis story were inspired by real events, and which were completely fictitious. Given the number of stories about legendary heroes being raised by animals, it's easy to see that as a later invention. But the story of Semiramis, being the wife of an advisor before meeting the king, could be inspired by real events. As Semiramis appears to have gone on campaign with her son, she may have had some military abilities like in the legend. It could also be that she had nothing to do with her army's achievements during her short reign. The associations between Semiramis and divinity make some sense. In an era where a woman having such authority would have been very rare, the only powerful women people would know of would be goddesses. The Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar would be fitting, as she was a goddess of both love and war. Using this, it would be possible to argue that Semiramis was able to be successful because she was divine in some way. Unfortunately, for now, this is all simply speculation, but it seems reasonable to assume that Semiramis was special in some way, to have inspired stories and legends hundreds of years after she fell from power. Typically, when someone goes missing, investigators are able to find a few clues in or around the area that they went missing, such as signs of a struggle, receipts from a store that they visited, or security footage from CCTV cameras in the area. But some disappearances seem to defy explanation. Their friends and family find that it's impossible to contact them because their phone is turned off or the battery has died. They leave no clue as to where they may have gone, and they're never seen or heard from again. While these types of cases are unusual and by no means commonplace, the 1975 disappearance of a woman named Martha Wright from the Lincoln Tunnel, which connects New Jersey to Manhattan in New York, is even more unusual, since she seemed to vanish into thin air in a matter of seconds, and the case remains unsolved today. Very little information is available on Martha and her disappearance, but what we do know is that she was with her husband, Jackson Wright, when it occurred. The couple was traveling in their car from New Jersey to New York City, and it had started raining. At one point, they needed to drive through the Lincoln Tunnel, a trip that they no doubt had made several times before. But on this occasion, things would turn out very differently than they usually did. They were the only car on the road, and as they passed through the tunnel, condensation had started collecting on the car's front and back windshields. They had no choice but to pull over, and Jackson was finding it hard to see and driving had become dangerous. He stopped the car by the side of the road and got out to wipe the windshield down, while Martha walked to the back of the car to do the same. It took just a short while for Jackson to finish his part of the chore, and when he was done, he looked up to see if he could help Martha with the other windshield. When he did so, he couldn't see her, and so he walked around the car to see what she was doing, but she was nowhere to be found. He was completely baffled since there were no other cars in the tunnel, and since there was nowhere that she could have walked off to. She hadn't been struck by a passing car. She couldn't have left the tunnel on foot in the time it took Jackson to clean the front windshield, and she certainly hadn't been kidnapped. She simply vanished off the face of the earth in the span of just a few seconds. Jackson contacted the police and a thorough investigation was launched, but no trace of Martha was ever found, and the case has never been solved. Due to the lack of information on the case and seemingly impossible circumstances surrounding it, many people have questioned whether it really happened, and if it did, whether Jackson may have had something to do with Martha's disappearance. But we simply don't know, and it's a case that will likely never be solved. On the 21st of December, 1964, an unusual event took place near Fishersville, West Virginia, when a man named Horace Burns, a gunsmith, was traveling to the area from Staunton along Route 250. He noticed that the area was unusually quiet, which must have been disheartening when his car's engine suddenly started acting up near the Woodrow Wilson Center. He knew that if the engine stopped, he would have no choice but to get out of the car and either fix it himself or find someone to help him, which would not be easy since there didn't seem to be anyone else around. Then, as he approached the Woodrow Wilson Center, he noticed something in the sky ahead of him that he'd never seen before. A strange metallic object was moving through the sky heading north, and as it passed over his car, the engine finally stopped. He would later tell investigators that it didn't roll to a stop as one would expect, but it stopped very suddenly, as if being controlled remotely. But what happened next perplexed him even more. As he watched the strange object pass by, it suddenly slowed down and started descending, eventually landing in a field about 100 yards from where he was standing. He then managed to get a good look at it, and later described its appearance as similar to a spinning top, only upside down. He also noted that it had no landing gear, doors, or windows. It was about 125 feet wide and 90 feet high, and a strange blue light was emitting from underneath. He could do nothing but watch as the craft sat in the field for about a minute to 90 seconds, and in this time it just sat there silently. But then it suddenly emitted what he described as a loud whooshing sound before it accelerated directly upward, something that he felt should not have been possible. He could hardly believe what he had just seen, and when he got home, he told his wife of the inexplicable event. They decided that it would probably be better if he just kept it to himself, since he would likely have been subjected to a lot of ridicule. But when they learned of the existence of a UFO club at the Eastern Mennonite College, he decided to contact them. He gave his account of what he had seen, and together with the professor from the college, he returned to the landing site to investigate. A Geiger counter that belonged to the professor gave some astounding readings of more than 60,000 counts per minute, and they decided to report it to investigators from the famous Blue Book Project. When investigators from the project traveled to the area, they found that the military was already conducting an investigation. It's then that they learned of even more sightings, seemingly of the same object. A 14-year-old boy reported that he'd seen the object about 20 minutes before Burns did. He spotted it when he looked out of his bedroom window and described it as cigar-shaped. At first, his family told him to keep it to himself, but when they learned of Burns' account, they decided to come forward. In an effort to explain the discrepancies in the object's shape, he stated that he may have seen it from a different angle, and hence it appeared to be cigar-shaped rather than a spinning top. He added that he had never seen any airplanes move as fast as the object did, and he found it strange that it didn't have any wings, landing gear, or a tail. In the months that followed, many more people in the area reported strange sightings of objects in the sky, and no official explanation has ever been given, leading many people to believe that it was an extraterrestrial craft that landed in Fishersville that afternoon. In July of 1907, King Edward VII was set to visit Dublin, Ireland. He was set to conduct a ceremony during which Lord Castletown would be sworn in as a new knight of the Order of St. Patrick. For this to be done, he would have to use the crown jewels of Ireland, which at the time were being kept in the Bedford Tower, under the watchful eye of Sir Arthur Vickers, who was the Ulster King of Arms. But on the 6th of July, to their dismay, they found that the crown jewels were missing, which seemed impossible since Dublin was inundated with members of the military and police officers, none of whom had spotted the culprit that stole the precious jewels. The jewels are described as having a star in the middle, which is decorated with diamonds, an emerald, and ruby cross. It also has a diamond badge and 5 gold collars that are also decorated with diamonds. All in all, it contains a total of 394 jewels, and it's worth millions of dollars. They would have been very hard to get to, since they were being kept in a strong room along with a few weapons and some important documents. To get to the strong room, you would need to have a key, but the only two that existed were kept by Sir Arthur Vickers. It isn't certain exactly when the jewels were taken, since nearly a month had passed since they were last seen in the safe, and there had been a few security issues during that time when the safe's doors were found standing open. Strangely, nothing was done on those occasions, but even more bizarrely, it seemed as though the robbers wanted to draw attention to their crime, since they left a ribbon and a clasp behind, though some people think they may have intended to return for those. With no leads to follow up on, a reward of £1,000 was offered to anyone with information leading to the jewels being found. And soon, even psychics were claiming to have had visions of where they'd been taken. This led to a lot of wasted time and efforts as graveyards were dug up. Many different areas were searched, and countless leads were followed, all to no avail. Sir Arthur Vickers was the first to feel the fallout of the robbery, as he was accused of being lax in his care for the jewels. It then came to light that on one occasion, Vickers had been drinking and was heavily intoxicated. The Viceroy's son, Lord Haddo, decided to play a prank on him, and he stole the safe's keys to open the case, and he removed the jewels. But he did send them back to Vickers by mail shortly after, but this should have never happened. The first suspect to be named was the brother of the well-known explorer, Ernest Shackleton. Francis Shackleton was known to have been struggling financially at the time, and he was one of the people that may have had access to the safe keys. But he was able to prove that he was abroad at the time of the robbery, but many people feel that he'd ordered someone else to carry out the crime, since the safe's lock was found to be intact, suggesting that someone familiar with the building had acquired a key. Many other people were accused, but the authorities were grabbing at straws in an effort to pin the crime on a scapegoat, and the culprits were never identified. Vickers was relieved of his post, and despite a thorough investigation being carried out, the jewels were never found and still remain missing today. In 1352, Thibaut de Castillon was serving as the Bishop of Lisbon in Portugal. Here, he tried his hand at overseas trade, and soon amassed a considerable fortune. But the bishop didn't always play by the rules, and it's been found that he was involved in corrupt transactions. This was known to Pope Innocent VI, but he seemingly turned a blind eye since he took no action against him. This resulted in de Castillon becoming a very rich man, but before long, he'd fallen gravely ill. He passed away on the 28th of May, 1356, and a new bishop was immediately appointed. There was now the matter of deciding what would become of de Castillon's riches. It consisted of more than 18,000 pounds of silver and gold, along with many valuable documents and more than 20 horses and mules. 8,000 pounds of silver and gold would eventually be used to repair the cathedral after it was damaged during an earthquake, though most of that sum was spent on matters involving extortion. But once all of that was dealt with, the rest of the estate was sent to Avignon in France, specifically to the Pope's residence. The transfer was entrusted to the Pope's executor, who boarded a ship called the São Vicente for the journey to France. But when it reached the coast of Cartagena in Spain, the ship was beset by pirates. But they wouldn't get away with their ill-gotten gains for long. The pirates' galley encountered bad weather, and it ran aground near Mugio, France. The ship was lost, and the treasure aboard sank beneath the water with it. But before long, pieces of the treasure started washing ashore, and royal notaries started collecting the pieces, claiming that they belonged to the Pope, and that they needed to be returned to him. The pirates responsible for the robbery were arrested, and while many were executed, those with higher ranks were sent to prison. Much of the treasure was recovered, but a substantial portion of it remained missing, as it still does today. It's said that much of the missing loot was picked up by locals, or that it simply is still lying at the bottom of the ocean, but there have been speculations that it was all recovered and secretly added to the Pope's growing coffers. This seems unlikely though, since the treasure would likely have spread on the sea floor, and it would have been virtually impossible to retrieve all of it. It remains unknown today what became of the rest of the treasure, and perhaps in the future, someone will be lucky enough to stumble across it. We've all come across reports of people who have seen strange lights in the sky, and very often these are thought to be extraterrestrial craft, or something equally sinister that we're unable to explain. But not all reports of inexplicable lights involve lights in the sky, as is evidenced by a phenomenon that's said to take place in King William County, Virginia. specifically on a set of train tracks that was once known as the Southern Railroad line. Here, you'll find the Cohoe Crossroads, though people who live in the area might discourage you from visiting the site since it's said to be haunted, specifically by that Cohoe light that appears there regularly. People have reported that on some misty and murky nights, a strange orange light appears on the tracks, and many witnesses have described seeing it swaying gently from side to side. But on other occasions, it's been observed holding steady and growing larger, as if it were the lights of a fast-approaching train. There have been countless efforts made to explain this strange event, but none have adequately clarified what causes it. Hence, there are many theories as to what it could be, but two are mentioned more often than the rest. He first mentions an incident that's said to have taken place during the 1800s. On one occasion, a train had stopped at the crossroads to be inspected by a brakeman. He would check the train for any problems with his lantern in hand, and if he found any issues, he would inform the train's engineer. But on this night, things wouldn't go to plan. The brakeman spotted an issue with a set of couplers between two of the train's cars. He decided to use his lantern to take a closer look, but as he did so, the train shuddered forward, ending the brakeman's life. It's said that the accident resulted in the man losing his head, and that the Cohoe light is the light from his lantern that can be seen swaying to and fro while he searches for it. But there is a second theory. Locals tell a tale of a Civil War train that passed through the area, and that it had Confederate soldiers aboard who'd been injured in battle. They were taken from Richmond to West Point, where they reached their destination as the train was attacked by Union soldiers. It's said that all of the soldiers aboard lost their lives, and that the train that's seen emitting the eerie orange light is that very same train that still contains the spirits of all those fallen soldiers still heading to West Point. Then there are those that feel that the light has some kind of extraterrestrial origin, since it's been seen changing shape and color without explanation. During one incident, a group of 5 friends was near the crossroads when they noticed the light shining as bright as the light from a welder. As they watched, the light disappeared and reappeared multiple times while changing from orange to red and back again. It also changed shape, and so they don't believe it was either a lantern or a train's headlight. While more mundane explanations have been offered, including that the light is caused by swamp gas, which can be very volatile at times, or that it's caused by some strange atmospheric conditions, no solid explanation has ever been found, and the Cohoe light remains an unexplained mystery that may never be solved. During World War II, Antonin T. Horak was serving as a captain in the Slovak uprising of Czechoslovakia. In October of 1944, he and 2 fellow soldiers were doing their best to hide from the enemy, as he and his companions had been wounded, and the group didn't want to be taken prisoner. On the 22nd of October, they stumbled upon a trench and decided to hide out there for the time being. During this time, Horak lost consciousness, and when he came to, he was being dragged through the snow by one of the local villagers. The man stated that his name was Slavek, and that he owned the pastures that they were in. He then built a crude stretcher, and for the next 4 hours, the 4 men made their way through the snow until they reached a grotto in the Tatra Mountains. The man told them to go into the grotto, but he seemed to regard the space as almost spiritual as he crossed each of them, himself and the grotto. It's then that Horak noticed a hole in the grotto's back wall. Slavek warned the men not to venture deep into the cave, stating that the grotto is the entrance to a massive underground network that's akin to a maze, and that they could easily get lost. He added that sections of the network contained pockets of poisonous gases, and that there had been multiple sightings of spirits in the caves. But the 3 men were more concerned with their own survival, and when Slavek left, they tried to keep as comfortable as possible in the cold conditions by placing hot stones around themselves. They had nothing to eat, but they dared not leave the grotto since enemy soldiers were patrolling the area, and since there had been heavy snowfall, the likelihood of an avalanche occurring was becoming ever more likely. But hunger got the best of Horak, and thinking that he might come across a hibernating animal, he decided to venture further into the cave. He walked for about 90 minutes before the tunnels widened into a passage with another large hole at the end. He decided to crawl through it, and when he emerged on the other side, he was dumbstruck by what he saw. At first, he thought he'd stumbled across a naturally formed wall of black salt, or lava, but he soon realized that the structure seemed man-made. He described the object as a large circular stone that took up most of the space in the chamber, and that seemed to be made of a polished metal, though when he ran his hand over it, it felt like stone. He then noticed a large crack along the length of the strange object, but when he looked inside, he could only see darkness. He then realized that there was a crescent-shaped object imprinted on the wall outside the chamber, and he felt that this was part of the larger object that he had seen. He struck the object with one of the tools that he was carrying, and was surprised when it gave off a green spark. The sound of it being struck was louder than it should have been, as it continued to echo for some time afterward. He made a note of the object's location, since he thought it might be valuable, and he could return later to retrieve it, but after the war, he immigrated to the US and never managed to raise the funds to return to the area before he passed away in 1975. But he had told many people about what he saw, and many attempts have been made to locate the object again, but the local government has refused to allow anyone to explore the area, leading many people to believe that it was part of an extraterrestrial craft that had crashed into the mountains and was being kept secret from the public. Though officials claim that the area is not to be explored since it's dangerous to do so, many people believe there is more to the story, and that Horak came across something that's not of this world. Dunvegan Castle is situated on the Isle of Skye in Scotland, and it's here where a strange flag belonging to the MacLeod clan is kept. It's known as the Fairy Flag and is said to possess some very weird powers. The clan believed the flag to be magical and that its unfurling would guarantee them victory over an enemy, but it could only be used in this manner 3 times. It's been used twice so far. The first incident took place in 1490, when the MacLeods were engaged in a fierce battle with the MacDonald clan. The battle was not going well, and they'd lost a lot of men, but then the flag was unfurled and everything changed. The MacLeods were able to turn the battle on its head, and they walked away victorious, much to the disbelief of their enemy, who was on the brink of victory before the flag was revealed and its legend started to grow. The next incident took place in 1520, during another battle between the same 2 clans. This time, as before, the MacLeods were hopelessly outnumbered, and their enemy was assured the victory. That is, until the fairy flag was brought out. As soon as it was unfurled, the tide of the battle turned once again, and the MacLeods romped to victory against all odds, seemingly thanks to the flag they were carrying. The flag was now seen as legendary, but its origins are steeped in mystery, as there are 3 different versions of how the MacLeods acquired it. One tale states that one of the clan's ancestors was fighting in a crusade when he was taken in by a hermit who warned him to stay away from a nearby mountain pass, since it was guarded by an entity called the Daughter of Thunder, who would swiftly do away with any true believers. But he wasn't about to be intimidated, and he tracked the entity down. They fought fiercely, but it was defeated, and it then asked MacLeod to take its girdle and spear to fashion the legendary flag along with a staff. Another claim states that there was once a great feast at the Dunvegan Castle, and that the clan's chief ordered that his infant son be taken to his room. There he became cold, and a fairy entered his room to cover him with a shawl. The following day, the child was brought into the main hall, still wrapped in the shawl, and as he was carried in, those in attendance could hear the strange sounds of fairies singing a lullaby, and hence it's still called the Fairy Flag to this day. The third tale states that a MacLeod chief had married a fairy, and they lived happily together until the fairy had to return to her own people. When the time came to part ways, they did so at the Fairy Bridge, and here she gave the flag to her husband, informing him that it could be used to win any battle, but only 3 times. The flag is also said to have the power to cure diseases in cattle, improving fishing hauls in the Dunvegan Loch, and that it can increase fertility in humans. It's also said that when the flag is unfurled for the 3rd and last time, it'll spell the end of the MacLeods forever, or that it'll be confiscated for good by an invisible entity. The flag remains shrouded in mystery, and its legend is one that will live on for many more years. Uncovering history as an archaeologist is hard, but often very rewarding work. And through the years, some very interesting and sometimes inexplicable artifacts have been uncovered that have left experts baffled. Some of these relics are found in areas where they shouldn't exist, or they contain materials that weren't available at the time, making their existence all the more perplexing. And in many of these cases, these mysteries have never been solved. But not all of these types of mysteries are found underground. One tapestry, known as Summer's Triumph Tapestry, is known to have been created in 1538 in Belgium, and it too contains some very interesting and perplexing imagery. The images are meant to depict a ruler's ascension to power and the joy that the summer season brings. But there are a few images that have left historians and experts baffled, since they show something that shouldn't be there. In the top left-hand corner, a number of strange objects can be seen. They're described as being hat or saucer-shaped, leading many people to speculate that the tapestry's creator had at some point in their life had interactions with extraterrestrials or their craft. The images have been compared to other religious depictions of the same medieval era, but none show these eerie objects in the sky. It's been suggested that these objects were purposefully included in a tapestry to create the impression that the reigning authorities were somehow connected to extraterrestrials, and were therefore seen as superior. It could also be the case that these objects would have been associated with the new ruler, and that he would then be seen as divine and all-powerful by the people who served under him. But for now, this remains mere speculation. Since people of this period may have seen strange objects in the sky, and instantly associated them with the heavens, it may be that these sightings were included in the tapestry as a tribute to the divine, or used as a suggestion that these divine beings were their allies. But this is not the only historical artwork that contains references to flying objects. In a painting from 1350, which depicts the crucifixion of Christ, two strange flying objects can be seen in the two top corners, and they've yet to be explained. The painting The Baptism of Christ was created in 1710 and shows a disc-shaped object in the sky, and it can be seen sending beams of light down toward the ground. Many people believe that this is an extraterrestrial craft that was seen at the event, and hence included in the painting. Today, the Summer's Triumph Tapestry is being kept at the Bayerische National Museum in Germany. Nothing further is known about these strange objects, and it's unlikely that we'll ever find any definitive answers to this mystery. If you were to visit Ohio University, you may be surprised to learn that there's one particular room in Wilson Hall that you'd be forbidden from entering. While you may think that it's because sensitive documents are being kept there, or because it's used as a storage area, the truth is far less mundane, as it's actually said to be extremely haunted. According to legend, the campus is located between 5 ancient cemeteries that form a pentagram under the building, and the room, number 428, is said to have seen some very strange events over the years. The first incident took place in the 1970s,